Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here. This is the first time I've gotten to come up to Ohio for a speaking engagement, so I'm pleased to share some things that we're doing. I guess I have a slightly different approach than what Dr. Bewley did. I'm relatively new at the University of Tennessee. I've been there just over a year, so I don't have any data from Tennessee to show you. So instead, I'm going to do more of a literature review, share some of what's been going on in the upper Midwest and Minnesota, and put that into context. And before I get started, so for the dairy producers that are here, how many of you are actively using composted bedded packs, and how many are considering going into? So how many are using bedded packs right now? Okay, and then, so the majority are here to consider going into that housing system? Okay, that's great. So for those of you that are already using it, hopefully this will fit with what you're seeing and observing on your farms. If not, then hopefully we can discuss at lunch as to why that may or may not be the case. So I'll start off, we've heard this idea of cow comfort, animal welfare mentioned a few times, and I'd like to start off with a nice definition of how I view that as a research scientist and the way that we're trying to work through this question of what promotes animal welfare or what is animal welfare. And this idea was put forth by David Fraser, and I think it's a nice definition that provides a win-win, both from the general public that's consuming, but also from the dairy producer. And it's based on the three factors of biological function. So how well is that animal doing? Is she producing a lot of milk? Is she producing a high quality of milk? Is she able to be bred? So is she healthy? All of those things that you want as a producer for a dairy cow. And then from my research interests, we have this idea of natural living. So is she behaving as you would expect? And what we're finding is these two are really connected, that when you promote natural behaviors, when you provide for her time budget needs, she's going to respond by being a much healthier, more productive cow. And then lastly, we have this idea of affective state. So we're good scientists, we don't want to talk about animal emotions, so we'll talk about affective state, whether or not she's stressed, whether or not she's displaying a stress response or the absence of a stress response. So as long as all of these factors are being met, then we can conclude that that animal has good welfare, or that our management strategy is appropriate. And we'll come back and refer to this definitions off the top, but it puts a nice context for things today. So let's just take a look at what was done up in Minnesota. They did a nice overview of a series of dairy farms that adopted this composting system and looked at how their cows responded. So just to set up this table, so here we have the key behaviors that we're interested from a lying perspective. So how many hours a day is she spending lying? How many specific lying bouts is she engaged in? And once she lies down, how long is that duration of lying going to last? How long is that lying bout going to last? So this just represents the average across their study. This is the minimum that any individual cow displayed across the farms that they enrolled. This is the maximum of a specific cow on the farms that they used. And then this is the average farm response and the maximum farm response. So from the minimum, you can see cows are spending about just over 9 hours per day lying down. And this fits actually quite nicely. So this data comes from a study that was done up in Canada. They looked at 45 freestall farms and just looked at the variation in lying behavior both within and across farms. And they found their cows averaged about 11 hours per day. On the composting bedded pack, they are averaging just over 9 hours per day. So roughly similar, at least from in terms of cow comfort in that perspective. We can conclude that they're promoting that quite well. For lying bouts, you can see the average is 11, which corresponds quite nicely to those in freestall, a little bit more. I think the one that stands out is this bout duration is actually quite shorter than what they observed on the average relative to the freestall that was actually closer to 90 minutes. So the typical bout on these farms that were using the bedded pack were about 40 minutes less than those in the freestall. And that could tie in both to that it's a shorter overall duration, as well as there's more frequent bouts. So cows are more comfortable, they're able to get up and down more often, so driving down the overall average bout. But what really stands out is there's actually quite a bit of variation both within a farm and across farms. So you can see that maximum 17 hours, minimum 2 hours, bounce down to just 2 per day versus 24 per day. Bout duration, just a few minutes, going up to several hours. Again, similar pattern here. Everything, since it's an average, is much closer, but again, still quite a range. So I think that just dovetails into what you've heard so far this morning, is that management counts. That if you're not managing it well, you're going to have much more variation within your farm, or you're going to have much more variation relative to other farms that are using this system. The other aspect that the study measured was looking at a diurnal pattern, and this again fits quite nicely with what we've seen across multiple freestall studies. So this line here with the diamonds, or the triangles, that represents their lying time. And as you'd expect, this is the behavior per minute. So most lying times occurring from in that early morning hours or the late evening hours. Similarly, as you'd expect, there's much more decrease in lying time during the daytime hours. Similarly, when you see lying going down, as you'd expect, standing's going up. So cows are spending much more time throughout the day standing. So they're taking much more of their steps. So this fits very nicely, and that basically general idea is that it's promoting the same typical time budget that you'd expect to see in freestall. So I think those two studies give us that solid indication that a well-managed composting bedded pack is going to promote behavior the same way that a well-managed freestall barn is going to promote. So I think from that we can conclude that there's really no risk for a detrimental effect on behavior for adopting this management system. One interesting thing that a group in Canada did was to look at what a cow prefers. So the one caveat here, this isn't a true composting bedded pack, but it's they basically pulled out the freestalls to create somewhat of a bedded pack system, and then just looked at cow preference. And they had both a no choice phase, so they just had the cows in one system or the other, looked at the behavioral response, and then they had a choice phase where their cow could pick between going to a bedded pack or going to a freestall. And what you see, regardless of whether or not they have a choice, cows prefer to be in the bedded pack system. So I think that, again, promotes the idea that this is a good system to consider, as cows will spend more time lying down when they're in the bedded pack. They'll also spend more time standing with 4 hooves in the pack relative to the alley. And that's true when they had no choice and when they had a choice. And there's some nice work looking at in the freestall arena that shows when you allow cows to stand comfortably with all 4 feet in the freestall, the rate of lameness goes down significantly. So when they're able to get out of the manure, get into a dry area, stand comfortably, you see less locomotion issues. I'm going to highlight that again later when I talk about the health aspects, but I think that's important to consider, that not only do cows prefer to be in this environment for lying, but they also would prefer to stand in this environment. And as Dr. Bewley mentioned, when it's working well, it's a nice dry environment. So that's, again, going to promote hoof health, which is, I think, one of the key issues that we deal with on dairy production. Oops. So just to review, I think this probably doesn't come as any surprise, but this is some USDA data as to what the major health challenges for dairy farmers are. And I think these top 2 are what we're going to focus in on mostly, but mastitis, lameness. I'm sure there's no producer here that would argue those probably aren't 2 factors that they fight with on a daily basis on their farms. These others are more relevant for transition cow management, so we're not going to really get into those aspects today. So we'll just focus on mastitis and lameness, or hoof and leg health in general. So this looks at, this is again some data from Minnesota. So it's comparing a composted bedded pack versus a cross-ventilated barn versus a naturally ventilated barn. And they defined mastitis as any cow with greater than 200,000 somatic cells, and what they found was 33% of the cows in their composted bedded pack met this criteria and were considered to have mastitis, relative to about 27% across the other 2 systems. This is consistent with some other work that this group had done, saying about 30% of cows in composted bedded packs were considered to have mastitis within this housing system. So I think...
I have a question.
Sure.
Here, the category is compost bedded pack barn.
Yep.
Cross-ventilation, natural ventilation.
Yes, and those are both freestall systems.
But with that cross-ventilation, natural, what kind of bedding? Because I think we're talking about compost bedding or freestyle sand bedding. Because the ventilation system is, well, there's combination, but it's not, I don't think it's category. I'm not clear actually for the cross-ventilation, what kind of bedding
Off the top of my head, I could tell you it's probably a mix of sand as well as sawdust, typical.
Some of those were using
And may also been manure solids.
Yes.
Because the compost bedded pack, we're using natural ventilation too. You also can use other type of ventilation. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I think the point here isn't to do a direct comparisons, it's just to show you this system relative to other systems and promote the idea that in some ways it can promote health, but in others it can present a challenge. When you break this down further, you look at, again, from this specific study, bulk tank somatic cell counts on some farms were improved, were made worse in other farms, and had no change in other farms. So same's true with the rate of mastitis, the percentage of cows. Some farms that when they adopted a composted bedded pack system showed improvements, some made no gains, and some got a bit worse. So I think as Dr. Bewley mentioned, for the mastitis, it's a question of management, whether or not you're coming out of a poorly designed freestall system that isn't working and going into an improvement just through a new system and managing it properly, or if you're not up to meeting the challenge of the composted bedded system, it may actually be worse than having a freestall system. So I think, just want to highlight that, and this is the point I make to producers in Tennessee that I've worked with anecdotally, you can't view this as a silver bullet for mastitis. It's not just going to this change. It's going to instantly show you improvements in somatic cell count. It has to be managed properly to reap the benefits of going to this system, or else you'll do either the same or worse than you were doing previously. And I think some of this goes back, Dr. Bewley again covered this, so I won't belabor this point, but it goes back to udder health. And there's some really nice work that shows when you have relatively clean cows, so in a 1 to 4 scoring system, those cows that would be considered a 1 or a 2, these cows are going to have, are much less likely to have a major mastitis pathogen isolated from it than these cows that are relatively dirty. So these cows on this scoring system, the 1 to 4, those that are 3 and 4. The nice thing here for using on-farm management, this is a highly repeatable system. So if you go out and score these cows from month to month, you're highly likely to call a 2 from 1 month to the next. So I think some of these, going back to that idea of mastitis on farm, you can see that there is potentially a detrimental effect of this housing system. So same study here comparing that composted bedded system to cross-ventilated or naturally ventilated. The composted bedded system in this aspect is slightly worse in terms of hygiene relative to those other farms. In the real world, is that necessarily that numeric difference? Is that really important? I think that would be highly questionable. But it is indicating that on the scale of 1 to 5, these cows are more towards that dirty side of things. So probably farms that aren't managing their bedding as well as they should. But again, these farms are not doing tremendously well either in terms of hygiene. Consistent here, looking at some other studies, again, on a 1 to 5 scale showed it can be quite good and it can be somewhat average. So I think, again, just keep reiterating that point. It's going to tie into management. If you don't want to make the commitment to managing it properly, you're probably better off going into a different system. And I think this is something that's quite interesting, looking at the lameness prevalence. So going back, that USDA study said it was about 15 to 16% of cows. But some recent work in the Northeast has shown that up to somewhere between 50 to 70% of cows might be actually considered lame in these northeastern farms. So again, a huge problem that we're facing as the dairy industry. And I think here there's some surprising results when they looked at the composted bedded system. Whoops, sorry. So yeah, this first top just looks at cows that are scoring either a 3, 4, or 5, and what the percentage in these systems is. So for heifers, it's doing quite well. Less than 1% of their heifers were found to be lame. For the cows, about 11%, and it was better than the 2 freestall systems. So it does give you an indication that you can promote hoof health potentially in these systems. However, this is still failing to meet what the farm program suggests should be the ultimate goal. That program, looking at overall animal welfare, promoting responsible management, says you should be 90% of your cows should be a 1 or a 2. So to be meeting that goal, these farms, so they're doing better than their freestall counterparts, but still not up to that standard that's been set by that program. However, from the severely lameness standpoint, that farm program says that if you're more than 3% of your cows are scoring a 4 or a 5, you need to implement some sort of prophylactic treatment. And actually, so here you can see that in that sense, the composted bedded pack is doing quite well. So overall, less than 3% of their cows would fall into that severely lame category, that 4 and 5, relative to these other systems, which again are doing well, but not quite as well as the composted bedded pack. So I think it goes into that idea that the composted bedded pack is providing them a nice dry environment to stand, get out of that manure slurry, whereas they may not have that opportunity in a freestall barn. I just want to take one moment to highlight one thing to consider. So some of these systems are implemented in conjunction with pasture. That original data I showed you on the average line times, spout durations. Within that study, the farms that had a mix of bedded pack and pasture actually had the lowest line times. Those farms were averaging just over 6 hours per day of line. And I want to say that we tend to promote this idea that line time is associated with good comfort, good health. But when you start to implement pasture systems, that may not necessarily be exactly the case. So those systems that had bedded pack and pasture, while they were the lowest, this data from Canada shows that that really probably isn't necessarily something to be concerned about. So this study set up groups of cows so that their average locomotion score was a 3. They wanted to have groups that the cows would be considered lame. They then housed them for 4 weeks on free stalls or in pasture. And what they found that even though lying time was lower for this group on pasture, they actually had a significant improvement in their locomotion scores. So cows that were considered significantly lame or were considered lame were now considered non-lame after just 4 weeks. So again, I think this highlights that idea that you can promote hoof health even if you're having lower overall lying times by using this approach relative to a free stall. And this is the last comment I want to make on locomotion scoring. And this isn't maybe the greatest data to make this point, but it's what we have right now. So again, this is a study done in Canada looking at can you use lying time to identify cows that are potentially lame. And what they found was the real one that stood out was when they're in a deep bedded system. So from a freestall bedding management, probably the most close to what you get in the composted bedded pack. They actually found a difference between cows that were a locomotion score of a 4 in that deep bedded system relative to a mattress. So again, I'm not saying that we're at that point where we can use lying time to identify cows that are lame, but I think this is a good indication of a direction that we can go in the future, especially for those producers that are on these composted bedded packs, since what we're seeing, at least in the preliminary stages, is that the deep bedded system seems to be more responsive to cows that are lame and identifying them through changes in their behavior. Unfortunately, I think for a locomotion score of a 4, I think most producers could go out and identify those cows readily anyways. The real problematic cows are these that were score of a 3 that are considered lame but not so severe that they may be those that are going to jump out immediately. So just something to consider, and hopefully a direction that we can work in the future is looking at how lying times are going to change over the course of a year in these systems if a cow is having a specific health problem coming up. And the last area I want to address for overall health is just the idea of HOC scoring. So this, just make sure we're all on the same page, is a commonly used HOC scoring system. This is from the New York State Animal Welfare Assessment. So using a score of a 1, which is a perfect HOC, so no swelling, no hair loss. A 2 where you have no swelling, but you do have some hair loss. And then a score of a 3 where you have either swelling evident or a lesion evident. So some work in the composted bedded packs has taken that same scoring system and applied it to looking as a means to compare, again, that composted bedded system versus cross-ventilated or naturally ventilated. And what they found was that, again, the composted bedded system was much better at promoting HOC health relative to those freestall systems. So cows, only about 3% of cows were either a 2 or a 3, and only 1% of the cows were a 3. But I do want to highlight again, just like locomotion, again, this is an improvement over the freestall systems that it's being compared to. However, the farm standards suggest that 99% of your cows should be a 2 or less. So we're having that issue that maybe we're not quite meeting that standard within the composted bedded system.
Is there ever an example where you do meet the standard?
That's probably the challenge. I think that's probably overly aggressive to say that we're going to have, especially those cows that are 99%. And more importantly, I think there's really limited data that shows that loss of hair is truly a negative for that cow. I think that's something that's promoted too readily when we don't have enough data to really support that notion that there's a significant biological consequence to that loss of hair. So just a few take-home messages to summarize things. Again, I think the behavior of cows from the studies that are available show that this is a very adequate system. No, it's more than adequate. I think this is a system that meets the cow's behavioral needs It's one that if you want to meet the management challenges, it's a great system to consider. But the overall impacts on health can be mixed. So in some senses, milk quality can be improved. On the other hand, it can be made worse, or it can be unaffected. So it's really an open book. There's no data that shows unequivocally if you implement this system, you're going to have better milk quality. So it's really up to the individual that's going to implement that system to make sure that it's managed properly and meeting the inherent challenges of this system to make sure that you're on the positive side of that aspect. Again, similar, hygiene can be good, or in some ways it can be unaffected. So again, management's the key. I think there is some good indication that locomotion is going to be improved in these systems. I think it is most reflective of an environment that provides the cow what she would get on pasture, where she's not having, you're reducing time on concrete, you're reducing the overall amount of moisture that she's exposed to. Again, assuming you're maintaining a dry, bedded system. And then lastly, hock health can be improved, but at the same time, it may be somewhat problematic overall. And I think that's really a challenge across all housing systems. And maybe that reflects that some of these scoring systems, as indicated, are maybe overly optimistic as to what a cow should look like.